my station top guard. Please welcome to the stage from California State University, Northridge, my alma mater, Professor Christian Tedeschi.
That's the musical theater people. I know you guys love me. I'm going to read something from the what do you call it, the playbill here about Katie, and then I'll say a couple words about her. But first, I'd like to thank the staff and everyone here has been so accommodating and helpful and supportive. It's really refreshing and nice. Joanne and Jessica and Laura and Rachel. You know, I mean, it's been really nice and really fun, and it's a wonderful opportunity for the students and for myself. I've been really having a good time. And also, I'd like to thank Brittany Hoovervorst and Sahara Hall, our PAs, who completely blew me away today with their presentation on their work. It's really amazing. And Andre, where's Andre? Is he here? Andre, okay. So, Katie Grinnan, her work is concerned with issues surrounding perception, the feeling of being housed in a the body extended in space, and its relationship to sight or point of view. She is interested in the way these experiences shape, translate, and distort our conception of self and reality. This inquiry is expressed through sculpture, photography, video, and sound. Katie's most recent work reflects the search for structure and form within complex systems such as the brain and the universe that resist resolution and are largely speculative. It is the alchemical yet paradoxical relationship between actual experience and our interpretations that has become the underlying focus of her work. She was born in Richmond, Virginia, and received her MFA from UCLA in 1999. She currently actually just got a full-time position at Cal State Long Beach in the sculpture program, which is great. She's taught all over the Los Angeles area. So she was at Art Center and Claremont for a long time. She's had solo exhibitions at the Whitney Museum of American Art at Altria in New York, the Aspen Museum of Art in Aspen, Colorado, and the Mack Center for Art and Architecture in Los Angeles. Her work has been included in many group exhibitions, including the 2004 Whitney Biennial at the Whitney Museum of American Art, New York, Real World, Dissolving Space of Experience and Modern Art at Oxford in Oxford, England, and recently, the Artists Museum at MoCA in Los Angeles. Her work is included in collections at MoCA, the Hammer Museum, LACMA in Los Angeles, and has been awarded the Guggenheim Fellowship and the Pollock Krasner Grant. She lives and works in Los Angeles, and she has an upcoming solo exhibition at Diverse Works in Houston in September. So, I mean, the way, I couldn't have written anything better than that, so I just read it. But she, I met Katie through, we were both assisting artists, Chris Burden and Nancy Rubens in Topanga Canyon. And, I instantly sort of liked Katie before, and I didn't even realize that she was the person whose work I had seen before. She had done, I'd gotten a catalog at an exhibition I thought was really interesting, and it was this artist that had sort of packed up her, she made all these sculptural sort of forms and kind of packed them up and kind of drove all around the country as it was like a float. And she kind of would unpack them at night, and they would do these performances. They kind of, it was it was just this really kind of curious project. And, it was right after like 9/11 and Katrina had just happened, and they were sort of going to these kind of impoverished neighborhoods and like kind of bringing, music paraded, and then the next, and then they would take it down and move on to the next town. And I was completely blown. I was so happy that when I realized, oh my God, you're Katie Grinnan, you're the one whose work I really like. And then we proceeded to get into a lot of trouble because we talked too much on the job, and so like I was just but she's I've come to know her pretty well, and she's a really sweet person, and she works with really interesting materials and processes, and kind of has no bounds. I mean, to say that she's a sculptor is like, that's really not, that doesn't encompass the breadth of her. She's completely, she's an intellectual. She's got a really broad range and knowledge of science and the body and the universe, and she's just a really interesting person to talk to. So if you get a chance, you should talk to her before she leaves on Sunday. Sorry, Katie. And it's just a real pleasure. And on top of that, she through her sort of research through materials and investigating ways to make her forms in the most efficient and environmentally friendly kind of manner, she's come up with, she's found these really beautiful, interesting materials and processes, and because I know her and I trust her, and I know that some of the students have worked with her before, I've tried to get people internships, and Sahara and Brittany have worked with Katie before as well. So it's a really good fit, and a really good time to sort of bring her in and sort of see what this material and this process was all about, and I think that the students would really benefit from that. So yeah, I'm totally thrilled to get to spend a concentrated amount of time, with Katie and have her with the students, and it's been really amazing. And yeah, but anyways, I'll stop talking. So no further ado, Katie Grinnan.
I've had the best time here. I've enjoyed it so much. I love hanging out with him and the students, and we've had so much fun. As you could see earlier, just experimenting with all these materials and making different things, and I learned a lot here too, because everybody has their own way of sort of approaching them. So it's been really, really great. And some of what Christian was talking about, I think a lot about sculpture. I think of myself as a sculptor, but I do, my work is sculptural. It deals with photography, it deals with performance and video and sound. And I guess I think that sculpture is a kind of mindset. And so I don't think about it, even though we're dealing with all these materials, I don't think about it in terms of medium specificity. I really think about it as a kind of way of thinking about the world. And so I think like a lot of different things can be sculpture. And I guess also, I guess having said that, I think of my work as being held together by certain things, certain ideas, and some of them Christian already mentioned, the body, perception, and sort of the way that perception shapes your own subjectivity and reality, space and time are also like concerns that sort of hold my work together. And so that's sort of a common thread, even though my work looks really different. And so it's not, a lot of times traditional artists have this sort of like conception of like a body of work. And so, and I think that I have that, but it's just a question of how you define a body of work, I guess. So I'm going to present my work, and this sort of collision between sculpture and photography, and that's something I really sort of wrestled with the whole time I was there. And then, and so I just wanted to sort of offer this up to some of the students, because I think this probably carries no matter what sort of medium you're working in. You know, this was the first sculpture I was really happy with. So, like, sometimes the deadlines that you have in school don't necessarily dovetail with your own pace and your own practice. And it's nothing to, you know, I think sort of shows are a way to sort of experiment. And, you know, the gallery should be treated as a lab, and I've always kind of treated it that way, or wherever you're showing. And so, you know, sometimes there can be a lot of pressure and stuff for these shows, and so this was kind of an instant where I was really happy with this piece sort of after, you know, the first piece that happened after the show. And with this piece, one of the things I was wrestling with this sort of collision between photography and sculpture. And I thought about this sort of problem in terms of the body. And so one of the things I'm really interested in is that, and it's a simple thing, but the fact that you kind of can't see your face. You know, and you have these two sort of holes for eyes, and then you're sort of, so you're seeing all of these things. And I guess I just started looking at sight as a kind of like extended skin. It was sort of a way of thinking about the body extended in space. And so, and it was funny because I moved to LA from New York. And in New York, you know, you're kind of like in close quarters with everybody, and you're walking around, and so like space is kind of close. And in LA, you know, there's not a lot of public space, and it's sort of, there's a distance. And so I was kind of interested in that. I mean, I think, you know, now I can say that that's a reaction that I had. And so I think in some ways the idea of putting your sort of sight, because I think that sometimes like there's a sort of dislocation that happens with your body and the thing that you're seeing. You can feel like you're not actually connected to that thing, even though you are. And so I thought it would be such a weird thing to put that thing back onto your body, you know, and to sort of have this sort of intimacy with what you were seeing. And so for me, this was kind of the first piece that did that, and I was really interested in this kind of inversion that happened. I mean, it's an early piece, you know, but the photograph kind of had this kind of like weight to it, this kind of like, and it was porous, and that the structure seemed like it was sort of floating and sort of ephemeral. And so I liked that the sort of material thing became ephemeral, and the thing that was normally sort of thought of as ephemeral would had this kind of materiality. So I liked that a lot. This is a piece called Shipwreck, and this piece was conceived kind of more by a kind of sensation. So I learned how to scuba dive in Australia, and I was really sort of taken with the sort of sensation of scuba diving. So and what happens to your body when you're scuba diving. So you really sort of propel yourself by your lungs. So when you fill up with air, you know, you can sort of rise to the surface, and when you blow air out, you kind of can like sort of propel yourself forward and sink down. So you can sort of maneuver in space by using your lungs. And then there was sort of this disorientation that would happen. There's a thing in scuba diving that I really like called nitrogen narcosis. I mean, I never got this, but it's kind of like this disorientation that you have. And I liked that there was a sort of lack of gravity. So I wanted to have something that sort of, or make something that sort of had this kind of motion. But then, you know, I'm landlocked after that. I'm back on land. And I live part-time in Topanga Canyon, which is this sort of like, it's in this sort of wilderness, outdoorsy sort of area. And so I just kind of, the way this was made, I sort of cobbled together the armature really fast with just I do a lot of analog and sort of digital photography, but at this point I was pretty much all analog. And so in the dark room, I exposed I got an image of the armature. Then I cut that out. You can sort of see it there in the center. And then I placed that back down and started swinging the color in the enlarger and exposing it multiple times. So what it did was it kind of created this weird sensation of motion. And for me, I really liked that the sort of like static armature all of a sudden created its own skin and the illusion that it was like in motion. And I also liked that there was this sort of potential in the armature for fall, like that it would fall or collapse, and that the illusion of motion was in the sort of skin. And so I liked that sort of like potential for motion in tandem with this sort of illusion of motion. And so some of these early ideas I think have really shaped what my work has become. This is a piece called Dreamcatcher. And I did this piece, half of this piece I made before I visited the rainforest in Costa Rica. And so I was kind of thinking about what it would look like, and I was, again, sort of cobbling together things that were around me. So I was taking images of like from neighbors' yards and the desert, and you know, it was anything but the rainforest. But then I was sort of like putting them together and collaging them to sort of create this idea. And then I visited the rainforest and took images there as well. And so the final piece kind of ended up being this this kind of collision of the anticipation of going to a place and then the memory of that place. So there was no, and it's all photographic, so there's no real sort of present moment there available. It's all about this sort of collision of like these sort of brackets of experience. And so that was sort of interesting to me. And sometimes I do have politics in my work, and I think sometimes they're like smuggled in through the aesthetics. And so, you know, I think that at the time there was the sort of Bush-Gore election, and there was a lot around the sort of resources and oil, and so I don't think that it's any accident that I was sort of focusing on thinking about like how we use our resources in the rainforest as a subject. Another thing that I wanted this piece to do was, and I don't know if it did, but that thing of disorientation is really important to me. And so I wanted the viewer, when they were standing underneath this, to feel like the ceiling was the ground. And so I liked the idea that this piece was all stemming from the ceiling, and that the ceiling was actually kind of the base, and so that it would maybe flip your orientation around. I don't know if it did that, but I really liked that idea. You know, and sometimes that's enough to drive a piece. This was all the stuff that this is only the kind of the only, like, in quotes, sort of real, tangible stuff. And this was stuff that I brought back from Costa Rica. And so it's sort of this faux mud puddle that's cut from my pants. And so it's sort of stemming from that. There's a weird thing in my work. A lot of my work, this is the point where it started to become figurative. And I think that a lot of the work that deals with a kind of specific site as a material weirdly feels like the inside of the body, even though it's something that's sort of exterior to yourself. I think it feels like something that's very interior. And then with the figurative pieces, they sort of, I mean, especially this one in particular, I think it sort of plays with that sort of one kind of interesting. I was really obsessed with Betty Davis, and I was really obsessed with Betty Davis movies, and so the face is actually a composite of my face and Betty Davis from Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte, and I was interested when I was watching, especially the ones where she's older, and kind of she kept getting these sort of like hysterical roles in some ways, and so and in Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte, her cousins are trying to convince her that she's crazy, and so I kind of in this piece I kind of liked that this figure could be sort of like hinging in between different things. So like she's kind of, maybe she's sort of delusional, or maybe she's a superhero and has superpowers, and so I or that she's both aggressive and passive and present and absent. It was really important that she was sort of shown in front of a kind of blank wall, so that she would sort of become this kind of, she was sort of like this ghost character, like this phantom limb or something. And I liked that. And another thing about my work a lot of times is that I think about, I'm not really showing that many images of work together, but I often think about the way you approach a sculpture. So this is the image that you would approach this sculpture from, and that was really important to me, that the first thing you were met with was this sort of like shield, hubcap, and I think a lot about that in terms of memory, and like the way that you move through space, and the way that kind of like sort of calcifies a sort of gestalt in your head, or image in your head, that then you can sort of play with or tweak. And so as you walk around this, and I don't have images of this, but the cape, she turns into this sort of like, she melts into these sort of hubcaps. And so then she becomes this sort of abstract figure, but you still sort of have this image in your head of the initial image, and so it's sort of deconstructing that. This is not my work. I'm gonna show some research images for the next piece, and sort of the way that I think about things. This is an artist, Rebecca Horn, and she made all of these pieces that would extend her body. And she was really, I think she was the first artist that I saw that was sort of interested in this idea of peripersonal space. And peripersonal space is a space that your brain maps your body like at the most that you can sort of reach. So like this would be your peripersonal space. But what's interesting is it extends to whatever object you're using. So if I'm driving a crane, for instance, my brain will map my body to incorporate the tip of the crane, and that will be my peripersonal space. To me, that's really interesting because it shows the sort of, I don't know, it shows that the body's boundary is sort of fluid, and that it's not as finite as we think. And I like the idea of sort of, there can be such a binary between sort of subject and object, and especially in terms of sculpture. And so I'm interested in sort of a kind of fluid space between those two things. I like to read a lot. And this is from a book called The Mind Has a Body of Its Own by Sandra and Matthew Blakesley. And it's a book that sort of deals with the brain and peripersonal space to some degree, though the extended body. And it sort of deals with case studies oftentimes to show that. And so in this case, it's about a woman named Eva who has this sort of frame delay in her brain. And so when she rests her hand on a table and then lifts it up, she has the illusion that she has three hands because of the sort of frame delay. And so And so I just bring this up because I think a lot of times, I mean, one question that I like to think about is whether space and time are out here or whether they're sort of tools of your own mind. And so I like thinking about the way your own mind calibrates time, and that's sort of different than the way like a clock would sort of calibrate time. That's sort of a subjective thing. I like particle physics and quantum mechanics, and so and this is a really famous experiment called the double slit experiment, where a photon, and hopefully I'm not going to butcher this. I have like, I cross a lot of disciplines, but I have kind of amateur mind, and I like that, but sometimes it's a little daunting when I'm speaking. But this is where if you send a single photon through these two slits, you don't know which slit it goes through, and if it's measured or observed, it acts as a particle. If it's not measured or observed, it creates an interference pattern and acts as a wave. And so that is a really, really weird thing about matter, because basically what it's talking about is that matter can be in both states, simultaneously. That like there's this sort of like probability state, or like this all of these possibilities of where something can be, and then it collapses when it's measured or when you see it. So observation is sort of implicated in that, and that I think is a really weird thing to think about when you think about a thing, and it kind of opens it up a little bit in terms of sculpture, because I think a lot of times as a sculptor you're kind of dealing with these like, the illusion that these things are really like, these solid things that are like not going anywhere. And in 2010 I went to India for about 5.5 weeks, and I was really this is in South India, in Madurai, and I was really taken with these temple facades with all of these like sort of figurative sculptures, and in particular this one in the center that was sort of showing the body maybe in this kind of like, I was reading a physics book when I was there, and I was sort of, so I started to sort of think about it in terms of quantum mechanics, and sort of thinking about the body as this, applying that to sort of the body in a way, and the body as a kind of probability state, or like that it, thinking about it that way, that it's sort of a speculative form. This is a scientist and photographer, A.T. and Jules Marie, and this is a really interesting. He developed this this thing called chronophotography, and he had this this gun that he would, not a real gun, but he like it was a chronophotography gun that he would basically, he was able to map the motions of flight patterns and motion. And what's really interesting about it is that it's all in a single frame. This is in like, early 1900s. It's kind of crazy. And then what's even weirder is, then he's made this object that sort of shows that. And so, and a lot of times I'll discover my art history references after the fact. I don't know if you guys do that sometimes, but sometimes, I'll discover these things after. And so I was also doing a lot of yoga at the time. I've sort of fallen off now, but I do a lot of the sort of like Vinyasa flow yoga, and so it's sort of like repeating these gestures over and over and over again, and so there was sort of like there was like a kinesthesia in it, so it really sort of did something to your mind, I thought, in terms of getting you in a certain kind of mental state also. And so in doing doing that, I thought about sort of mapping that motion in space and making it into a solid form and using the body as a kind of system. And so this is the material that we've been experimenting with some. And so this sort of shows a little bit of the process of sort of making this next form. And the weird thing is, like I didn't know what this sculpture was going to look like. And so even though it kind of looks in the end sort of like this form, like, oh, of course it looks like that. There were a lot of decisions to kind of make in sort of seaming it together that were really important. And in some ways, it's looking at the body as a kind of stock frame animation, and the way that I had to hold all of these poses, and so there are lots of ways of like, it was anything but yoga, or yoga. It was sort of like I had to like hold my body for like 20 minutes, and sometimes longer in these different positions. So, for instance, down dog. This one was a particularly difficult one, and in this case, I was in this position for 2 hours, and I thought I was being really smart by making this sort of support to get the weight off my arms and legs. And what I didn't think about was when the plaster gauze was gonna come afterwards, and then it really starts to get heavy, and so like I didn't put a pillow at that point, and so you make these mistakes, and they're kind of severe, but I basically bruised my femoral nerve. I was like, I can't feel my leg, and then had to go to physical therapy, and they gave me this machine that basically like, it was great. You'd hold it in your hand, it had like a metal rod, and you'd hold it in your hand, and then you'd stick it into your nerve to sort of shock your nerve back into existence. And you can think about like your body as a kind of like electrical system, which is super interesting. And I haven't made a sculpture about that yet, but I'm interested in that. But it did something. And so then here's the mold. But that's one mold. But there were a lot of molds, and so, and again, this was sort of like thinking about the approach. This is at the Hammer Museum, and I really liked this view as the sort of like approaching view, because it was sort of hard to get a sense of what it was, and a lot of people thought it was like a spine or this sort of weird like jellyfish, like amorphous thing. They didn't know what it was. And so I liked that it could be this sort of abstract thing or feel like part of like a body part. And then as you start to walk around it, it starts to sort of reveal what's happening and what's going on. And it's covered in sand. And so I like thinking about, again, this sort of like accordion space, this like dynamic space. And so, this kind of particleization of sand I liked a lot. And the piece is called Mirage. So it has this kind of, and you can, I like that you can sort of interpret it in a lot of different ways. And a lot of people, this is the most realistic part when you walk around to the back. And so a lot of people didn't sort of recognize what was happening until they sort of felt the feet, and then all of a sudden. But it's a piece that I think you can feel. You can sort of project yourself into it, and you can project yourself doing the motion, so it has this sort of kinesthetic feeling in your mind. This is the piece Christian was talking about. It's called Rubble Division, and I'm not doing this in chronological order, but this was kind of around 2005, 2006, and this piece started because I was invited by the Aspen Art Museum to be the float in the Aspen 4th of July parade. And this was at the height of the Iraq War, so I wasn't entirely feeling the patriotic. And so I wanted to do something with the space of the parade. I thought that was a really interesting space to deal with because oftentimes in a parade, there's like a thing, moving through on the road, and then there are two sides oftentimes, like there's, and so people are lining up on both sides of the street. And so I've taken images of this sort of destructed building, and on the other side was this kind of modernist-like building. And the only way that the viewer could kind of get a sense of the other side was to talk to one another. And so I liked that there was this kind of communication that was necessary to understand the whole, and that there was a kind of mythology. And so this piece was done in 3 different iterations. And so then there were these panels strung along the road in the desert at this thing called High Desert Test Site, which is a fantastic thing that Andreas Attell holds. And it's a sort of venue for experimentation. And so I thought about it there as sort of reversing the constructs of the parade and sort of becoming this animation. And so the viewer would drive by and look through these holes, and it would I thought it was going to make this sort of stop frame animation. And then this is where the panels are being put together on the back of this trailer, and then we drove it across country in about 2 weeks. And so there's musicians on the back of the trailer. There were, and the piece it collapsed, and it broke down and built up every day, and that was sort of a part of it, that it would cannibalize itself and regurgitate itself every day. And so we sort of toured these ruined spaces. You could look at some of them as ruined spaces. And well, Vegas was one. I don't know if that's a ruined space. That might be more of the space of like a spectacle. And so in each space that it toured, we toured Crawford, Texas. We went by the Bush Ranch. We went to DC. We went to Flagstaff, Arizona. We went all over the place. And in each place, the sort of Death Valley, the Wapaki ruins. Each place, each particular site was a kind of material, I thought, or a kind of lens to look through. So the sculpture was kind of staying the same in some ways, but the context was sort of changing. And so in a weird way, the greater context was sort of operating the way I initially thought about, like collapsing photography and sculpture as a kind of lens to look through. This is it at Socrates Sculpture Park in New York, and that's where it sort of ended. One of the interesting things about this sculpture was in Crawford, Texas. We were pulled over by the Secret Service, and they took our cameras and sort of lined us up. And I had been prepared for this kind of thing, and so I had like a brochure saying that I got the Guggenheim grant and that this was like sort of like this legitimate thing. And it wasn't until, and I said, this is a sculpture, and I thought that was a really innocuous word. And it wasn't until one of the performers that sat on these boat seats on the back and played music as we were going, sometimes 40 miles an hour, said, we had seatbelts. That was very important. When we got pulled over, everybody always wanted to know if we had seatbelts, and we did. But he said that we were protesting, and then the Secret Service understood that, and then that's when I kind of realized, sculpture is really powerful. It's really like, because it's so nebulous, because it doesn't have a function. That's a really powerful thing. It doesn't have a definition. This is setting up a different sculpture that also sort of deals with place and sight as a kind of material and kind of narrative trajectory that it kind of creates, like in your head. This is an image from Mars. I actually don't know if it's real or fake, but it doesn't matter. It just sort of illustrates this point. Supposedly, it's Venus, Earth, and Jupiter all seen from Mars. And the next piece that I'm going to talk about is this piece called the Astrology Orchestra. And, this just shows you can make art about anything. And so I, in this case, used my astrological birth chart. And the reason I picked sort of astrology as a kind of system for this piece was because astrology maps a place, a date, and a time in space, and sort of like talks about what you can see in the night sky from a specific position. And so what I did for this piece was, this is what a birth chart looks like. There are all these sort of angles, and it sort of, in astrology, they sort of connect these different planetary alignments that you can see in the sky. So there's like the hemisphere that you can see and then the hemisphere that you can't see. But really it's sort of like showing what you can see and what you can't see from the perspective of a planet. And so what I did, I found online this guy that had translated some specific dates from the perspective of all the planets. And so I basically made instruments for all the planets, and with my birth chart on it, but my birth chart from that perspective of that planet, if that makes sense. So it's as if that sort of time and what you could see was sort of blown out in space, and sort of showing all the different perspectives in that one moment in time. And so this shows sort of tuning chart of these instruments that I made. And so, and Kepler had a system for this. He was an astronomer and an astrologer. And so he translated a lot of the astrological aspects, which is what these angles are called, into notes. And so the first place that we performed the Astrology Orchestra, and so each instrument is a different planet. Each person that's playing they're all pretty much, not all, but amateur. There's some musicians, but they're all pretty much amateur at this. And it's a system-based thing. And so this is at the Mount Wilson Observatory, and this is where Harlow Shapley discovered that we weren't the center of the galaxy, which I thought was kind of a good place, and it to start. and so what the metronome is a conductor of the Astrology Orchestra, and it's tricked out to a 10-beat cycle, so that, and the way it works, it's a system-based thing, but there is improvisation. So if you start at Aries, whatever strings are crossing that sign, you could play within the beats of the metronome. And you can play them in any order, so that's sort of the improvisational part. Then on the 10th beat, a bell rings and you shift. And so that's sort of the nature of the orchestra, and the system that sort of dictates it. So it's very discordant. I'll play it for you in a second, or part of it. But it's not a harmonic thing. And a lot of the notes, because I'm tuning things in like a triangle, I could tune one string, and so one string would be a note, one part of the triangle, but the other parts would sort of fall out to sort of these tones, and so it was sort of a mixture. But this is at the Venice Beach Biennial, which was very close to the drum circle, and so already the sort of context sort of changes the piece a lot. And in this case, we were in a really public space with lots of, there were lots of sort of helicopters in Landers, California, was close to Joshua Tree in the desert. And the integratron is a really interesting structure that was made by an aeronautical engineer, George Van Tassel, and he used to work for Howard Hughes and then moved to the desert and says that Venusians, people from Venus, gave him the plans to make this dome, and he made it, and so it's over this geomagnetic spike that's supposedly under an aquifer that resonates the space, and it was supposed to be conceived of as a kind of time machine, or cell rejuvenator. I mean, if you look online, it's amazing. There's a lot of stuff about this, and it was supposed to sort of rotate, but now these two sisters bought it, and they do these sound baths there, and basically the whole thing is this giant resonator. It's amazing, and so the instruments are modeled after these. And so now this is something completely different. Oh, let me play the orchestra for you, just a snippet. That sort of gives you a sense. It's very discordant. And I should mention too that Christian Tedeschi is in that. Everyone is cast according to their sign, the performers, and so he's an Aquarius, and so he plays one of the instruments. And so I wanted to show an image of Jackson Pollock because I think that sort of sets up this next piece in a good way. And I was kind of thinking about, I think a lot about your brain and the way that the brain sort of shapes your perception, and that's a sort of reciprocal thing. But also just like, I mean, I had worked so much with analog photography, and I really understood that. That was kind of like dealing with the body and space and light and these spatial things that were kind of haptic that I could sort of feel. And then with digital space, it was really confusing for me as a sort of sculptor because it was sort of like based in information and code, and there was a kind of density to that. And so I thought about, if you think about Pollock and you think about gathering information and maybe using a camera and thinking about this kind of density, that was something I was thinking about in terms of sort of conceiving this next piece called Brainwaves. This is a diagram of the piece, and you'll see it has so many parts that at some point I had to make the diagram in order to be able to put it together and take it apart because I couldn't remember all the parts. I think it has like 110 parts. This is the final piece. And it took me 3 years to make this piece because there was a certain amount of time that had to pass in order for me to gather the information and in order for it to sort of take shape. So a lot of it, I think it would be a totally different shape, a totally different piece if I hadn't sort of, if I had sort of taken a different path in a lot of ways. And that's the way your brain sort of works a lot of times. And so the way that it started, I was sort of making these images of all of the homes that I had lived in, because I thought of something that was hardwired, and I was like, okay, maybe that's sort of something that's hardwired, and I would press them into molds, and it was of the thing, and then, but they sort of didn't match up, so it was sort of about that thing, like, and its interpretation sort of not like necessarily matching up, like your translation of a thing and the thing in reality, I think, don't really like sync up a lot of times. And then I was sort of gathering information. So I was traveling to places. I went to India. I went to Vegas, the desert. If I had gone to different places, it would look totally different. And then there were places around Los Angeles that were in here. And then I wanted to make them all into sort of wireframe images. So they started off as photographs, and then I would, in Photoshop, trace out all of the imagery except for the wireframe image. So, which was very tedious and boring. And so, as you know, some work, not all work is fun. And so, and I wanted it to sort of layer up into this sort of abstraction, so that, again, you couldn't sort of get a sense of the whole thing. Like the viewer would have to like sort of focus their attention on different things at different times, and that would dictate what they took away from the piece and what it was about. So everybody's interpretation, I was hoping, would be kind of different. So while I was sort of tracing out the wireframes, I was listening to all these lectures on YouTube, on the brain, on the universe, on sort of like technological innovations that were sort of, that made me anxious. And so I started to realize that was part of the piece. And so I started to make a script, and I started to sort of document that. So the cerebellum sort of has the two screens of the piece in process, which would be this sort of space down at the bottom. And then the images of the YouTubes that I was watching, and then I was also sort of writing the script that actually projected back onto this sort of ghost-like form in the front. So it's sort of projecting itself onto itself in a lot of ways. And so the script would have sort of these video images that would go along with it. There was a lot about the BP oil spill. There were a lot of different current events that happened at the time. This piece was really generative for me, and that happens a lot with my work. So this was a photogram that happened from the images, and so again, it's the same sort of the same thing that I was doing in that early piece, Shipwreck, where I was like laying down all these volumetric forms and using them as negatives, but also they were sort of a photogram, so they're also an object. And then they layer up and become this sort of abstraction. They were sort of like, I called these inner weather. It was like this sort of series. And then it also generated this piece, because, and this has the soundtrack of the script of the other brain coming out of it. Because after a while, I started to think, well, God, the brain is like the weirdest thing on the planet as an object. I mean, I feel no ownership over this thing whatsoever, but like it houses like supposedly what my entire identity is. And I just thought, well, that, that's such a strange thing. Seemed really abstract to me, even though it's a really like sort of realistic part. A lot of times my work is sort of like problems that arise in one piece sort of steer me to the next. And so one of the things that I started to realize was that it was And the brain piece, is all about me. And I wanted to, and I wasn't really interested in self-portraiture. I was interested in like this sort of set of operations. Myself as a kind of operating system in a lot of ways. And so this piece is called For Your Information, and it's a weird piece. It's still kind of going, and it's always in progress, so it's always being added to. So this is sort of the germinal stages of this piece, and it was a really hard thing to show because I don't necessarily like it in this state. It's like kind of showing something partially done. It feels sort of uncomfortable. But what I did was I asked 50 people from my community in Los Angeles to contribute information of any kind. And then I sort of, that I was going to use. And I made it very clear in the invitation that I was going to use this information for images and as this sort of archive. And so it's a kind of weird piece, but it had these, this is all the sort of information. The information sort of dictated that I got, dictated the content, but my job was kind of thinking about these headers. And so there was a kind, like it wasn't, it's not organized in alphabetical order by like the Dewey Decimal System or something like that. It's sort of thinking about like a sort of associative chain that sort of happens. And so this one I really like. And certain categories were really thick, depending. And so gardening, constructing nature bugs, complexity and self-organization in pilgrimage systems, harmonic convergence, casterism, brain, psychology, deception, optical illusions, and the old magician's notebook. And so there's kind of like, you can kind of get the logic, maybe, but also I think a lot of times with this piece, like your brain sort of has to do this sort of mental shift. This is one of the files, and one of the things I liked was that the information could be sort of cross-filed, and so this is from Love and Romance, but also the sort of the piece about Carl Sagan and Andrew Ryan's ultimate mixtape is also under space. So things were sort of, it showed sort of multiple perspectives. You could see things repeated in different places, and I think a lot about the way your brain sort of organizes things and these sort of associative chains that can sort of shift in chains and change. And it's sort of, so in a weird way, even though this piece seems like about categorization, really it's about subverting the idea of categorization and the way words sort of define things. And so I also asked people to contribute a YouTube, which was really fun. This piece was super fun because it's not my head, it's all these other heads, and I really, and it was this sort of communication that happened that was really beautiful, I thought, back and forth about this information and exchange. So I took a still shot of each of the YouTubes and transferred it onto concrete. And so you would be walking on these images, and the images would break under your feet. And I thought that was kind of this beautiful thing, this kind of ruin of our technology. And this piece travels from place to place. And so here it's in Philadelphia, and I worked with the students at Temple University because it seemed silly to ship all of this concrete. We remade the concrete there, which was really nice, and then I got to know a lot of the people in Philly. And so then the piece was shown there, and it started to sort of, each time it gets added to, it gets a little bit bigger, and I think it's going to start to keep, like it's going to continue to configure each time. It has a totally different cadence or like feeling in the space as opposed to the MOA, which is the LA Museum of Art, which is this museum, in quotes, by an artist named Alice Kunitz, who's an amazing artist, and it's kind of a provisional museum. It was outside her studio. It was a very artist-based project, as opposed to this, which was sort of like this public place. This was at the Print Center. And this is at Claremont University, and this was a weird thing because this was a failure, and sometimes that happens with interaction, and people really didn't interact or contribute to the piece, and so this is the last place that this piece is shown, and it's kind of presenting an interesting problem for the next site because they don't have any information. And so, and it just depends on the place. And so, I think I'm going to kind of completely reconfigure this and the seats. The seats were really interesting for me and the way that for me, it was a lot about, the seats were these sort of workout seats, and it was sort of, the piece was about the way the body and the mind sort of shape one another in a lot of ways. But also, in this case, the seats are facing away from each other. I was looking at a lot of like home gyms as reference points and the way home gyms were kind of structured. And so, but it was also sort of like this thing where it's really, you're sort of facing away from each other. And so even though you're like in proximity to one another, it's really hard, I think, to know another person. And it also sort of speaks to the sort of digital age. This is this work that I'm going to talk about, which is my newest work, and I haven't talked about it yet, so I might be a little rusty in the way I describe it. But this is a piece called Interface, and it's going to show in Houston in September. But I wanted to sort of bring it here, and it's based on dreams. But really, I mean, so much of my work initially has to do with a site that's outside my body, like a place as a site. And I really wanted to think about the way, start without that sort of external site, like so that the way a sort of like image or representation comes into being in your head from all of these like synoptic signals and the information in your brain, like how that associated chain sort of forms. And so, I mean, it's a really crazy looking piece, and it's another piece that took a really long time to make. It took about 2.5 years because I was reenacting all of these dreams, because at some point I had to like sort of see them as images. And so it was a really fun piece to make because I gave myself sort of rules. And one of the rules was to use really sort of inexpensive materials. It wasn't about mimicking the dreams because that was impossible. And so it was sort of about the absurdity of the translation of the dreams. And that made it seem really free and really fun. And so there are videos on all of these, they're headrests from cars. You probably recognize them. And so it kind of places the viewer in the space of the backseat driver, or in the backseat of a car. And so I just wanted to sort of show a little bit of one. I'm going to fast forward this to a certain place, but you'll get the picture kind of just from doing this. Okay, so. is a chase dream. So they're made with very simple means, as you can tell. But they were really fun to do. And I think it was this piece, it's not the sort of thing where I expect people to necessarily get into my head or like interpret the dreams. There's something more about sort of the way your sort of subconscious works or puts things together like a Rolodex. I'm not interested in, weirdly, in necessarily surrealism or in sort of like Freudian interpretations. I'm more interested in like in this sort of neuroscience around it. And also, it sort of became this display system, and and I would ask myself, what is Annette Bening doing in my dream from the movie American Beauty? And and this is a dream where I was making her miso soup, and like sort of there was really high pressure to make it perfect, and I was messing it up, and then it turned into this sort of rainbow that I made. But there are all these different sort of like vignettes and lenses in the piece to sort of look through, and depending on where you are in space, you'll sort of experience it these different ways, and you'll see different things. And so there's a lot of these sort of apertures and sort of things that are like made of the transparent sort of filmic things that are volumetric. Those are sort of these polar bear forms that you can sort of look through, but really there's no. It's not a fascist piece. There's lots of places that you can look and stuff. One thing that I was kind of interested in that happened in the piece and in my dreams, weirdly enough, was I started to realize like what my go-tos were. And so Annette Bening, weirdly, like when you're standing here, the wig that we used for the clown video looks like the back of her head. And then when you walk around, there's this whole other thing that starts to happen. And I really liked that like for instance, there's this one, I don't think you can see it here, but maybe in the next one. Well, this sort of shows, okay, so there's, right here, there's a vitrine with a cat, and it's underwater, and that's one dream that I had. And then there's another dream that I had kind of maybe a year later, where I was wearing this is embarrassing, but like I was wearing this coconut mask, and it was this respirator, but it was the cat, and then the water was I was by the pool, and weirdly, so all of these things, like, the cat was underwater, my nose and mouth are covered, the pool is sort of like the water. So there was something that I started to notice with my own dreaming where I started to sort of realize, my own sort of Rolodex in my head and like the way I would make my meaning system, my operating system in this sort of subconscious way. This front piece, which I really like as a sort of entry point into the piece, was a total failure in terms of what I wanted it to do. But I like it, like what it ended up being. I had a dream where I saw 13 tornadoes coming towards me through And so each of these sort of things that now looks like sort of a vantage point had a tornado on the end of it, but it looked really crassy. It looked terrible. And so I realized, well, this is a bust, you know. And so then I realized, oh, I have to be the tornado. Duh. You know, like, I don't know why that's the way my brain works. But I started to notice that I was, like, these are all sort of anxiety dreams, and I started to realize that I was kind of inhabiting my anxiety a lot of times. You know, and I think that this piece in particular shows how sort of culture sort of, I don't know, like how we don't really necessarily own ourselves or own our thinking or own our identity. You know, that like Annette Bening's in there and Will Ferrell's in there and the Olympics are in there, and like, you know, it's just a reflection of the outside world, even if it's in the sort of darkness of your head. So this is this piece of me embodying this tornado, and it took a little bit to get there. And you might not necessarily see it that way either. This is just how I see it. And it sort of became like my form also as a kind of glitch in space. So it was about that sort of like, I mean, a glitch is sort of interesting because it's an image, and the way that you make a glitch is you scramble the code. And so, and that creates a new image, and that creates this sort of glitched image. So it's the way that the code is related to the image. And so I was kind of interested in that as a kind of time space, because I didn't want to do the same thing as make a sort of stop frame animation. It was this sort of other type of time that I didn't understand, which was the space of the glitch. And so this is my body spinning in space, and I was looking at a lot of different ways of spinning. You know, I was looking at dervishes and breakdancing and figure skating, like all of these sort of spinning motions. I was thinking about tornadoes. And then ultimately, to do this piece, I always kind of map it out with my own body. So, and I can't hold myself up. I mean, some of you can, I bet. But I can't hold myself up with my hands and do this sort of spin. And so I hung from this tree. This is our place in Topanga, and spun. And that's how I sort of mapped it out. And I was wearing these crazy pants, you know, by accident. It wasn't like I was planning this. But then I really liked the pants as a kind of color scheme. And so I actually scanned the pants and glitched the pants to get the color scheme of the tornado. And so the rug is actually a woven, glitched example of the pants that I was wearing. And so that was kind of like, that sort of shows the sort of logic system of that piece. And this is it before I cut it. You know, and it's kind of, it's beautiful and it's kind of elegant, but it's also very static, and I didn't feel any of the dynamicism that I wanted it to have. And so it just seemed sort of like this weird column, you know, and I really hated it. And so I was like, oh, this would be a good time to like actually cut this piece. And Brittany and Sahara both worked on this piece. And Brittany was there during a lot of these cuts. And so this sort of shows there was this kind of weird phenomenon that happened when I was cutting the sculpture, where you had to sort of be forensic about it to put it back together. And this sort of shows, so I had to label the piece to sort of get it back together. And it was really beautiful in the interior too. This is the last piece I'm going to show. And it's called Nocturnal Hologram. And this, one of the phenomena about sleeping or dreaming is that I really responded to is your body is pretty much paralyzed, and it's so that you don't act out your dreams, and that's one of the differences between waking and dreaming, because there's not a lot I mean, there's some chemical shifts, but it's almost the same thing. And I find that line and sort of thinking about different states of consciousness really interesting. And so this, I took molds of myself, Brittany and Sahara both helped with this piece too, in the sleeping state, and I was spinning sort of slowly. So all of these new pieces sort of have this spinning, the sort of anxiety or the brain that you can't turn off, that's sort of like in this sort of mediascape, the sort of power of the motion of the spin, and then the sort of slow turn that happens when you're in bed. It's sort of, and there's a lot of stratification that's happening in this work too. And so I made images from the interface piece and then pushed them into these molds. So I made these sort of photograms, pushed them into the molds so that the image of this sort of anxiety and the structure were one and the same. But what I was thinking about was, the idea of like sort of sinking into your own head in sleep, kind of like at the same time you're sinking into your own head, there's like this mass distance from yourself also. So, that kind of phenomenon. And it was really important to me that the topology of the piece was the entire structure. And so I basically melted holes into the piece and pulled them through to meet the other layers so that they would so that it was a sort of solid topology in terms of like inside and outside. Like it was a piece that I don't know, it felt like, I don't know if you guys have seen images of space-time or like the gravitational pull around like the Earth. There are these diagrams of like sort of black holes or wormholes or the way that gravity works. So I like thinking about them like that, or like the space of a cave, the cave in your head. I like thinking about it in all these different ways. And this is the last image, sort of showing a close-up of it. But I'd love to take questions if there's time.
Okay. So for this piece, did you essentially just cover yourself with plaster like the other pieces? Because this is more of a, it seems like you put like a sheet over you and then just mold it yourself.
Right. I know, and it's a tricky thing because a sheet and the wrinkles will collapse under gravity. So there's a material called fabric form. That's an amazing material. That's basically like this sort of plastic material, but it hardens faster, and it's very thin. So the way my studio is in, I'm kind of a nomad. I kind of go to different places, and so one of my studios is in a swimming pool in Topanga Canyon, and what's great about it is it has a slope, and a drain, and you can be messy in it. And so basically what you do is like I'd lie down. We pour hot water over the plastic. It would go drain down the swimming pool, and then I'd lay down in bed, and then the sheet would come over top of me and harden. Then I'd be able to stuff it. Then I'd be able to take the mold and actually, come out of it, so I wouldn't have to like sit there forever. So that was a way of working in the pieces like Shipwreck and the one with the brain, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of it, interface, I think. You have like these plastic shapes, I mean, of the ones that you printed on, but there were some that had like just patterns on them. I was wondering, because those patterns were really, really, really beautiful. How did you make those patterns? That's question one, and then question two is what material is it? Like, it's like fiberglass?
No, on the brainwaves piece or on the interface, it's this material called PETG, which is the way it's a material that they use to vacuum form like objects, like wafer but what's great about it, it's basically a thermal plastic that I felt like, sat like a negative, and print, I could print images on film that would be transparent, and so that's the material, and then the shipwreck piece, the photogram process, the shipwreck piece is analog, and the brainwaves piece is digital, and so they were made different ways. So the shipwreck piece was made for this photogram process of putting the image, cutting out the image of the armature, putting that onto a piece of photo paper, exposing that with the image, with the original image, sliding that like multiple times and sliding that cutout across the image, and at the same time, and this is all in the dark, so I can't see. It's all, and that's something I really like. It's like a haptic space. Like you can't. I think about the dark room and like, the space of a dream or the space of your head. Like because it's haptic. It's like you don't know what you're going to get. It's like those sort of chance operations. So, and then I would swing the color in the dark with each exposure, and that's how I made the surface for the shipwreck. And then the brainwaves one was printed on that PETG, and the patterns were the images of the places that I had been, and I would put those in Photoshop and then trace out or erase out all of the imagery except for the outline of the space, so like the wire form of the image. And then those would layer up and sort of make these sort of like pattern-like forms. Does that make sense?
Any other questions or?
You seem to have this crazy, beautiful, brilliant mind, and my question for you is how do you log yourself in your dreams? You wake up and just write everything down, or do you remember midway and have to write it down? And do you get better at it by doing it? Or how do you keep track of your mind?
And then like, I got really good at it after a while, and I was really in this, and sometimes like now I'm not really remembering them as much, and I'm not logging them as much. But my first memories are dreams, and so some of the images from the interface are these really early images, and it's kind of before your brain's fully formed too. So like there were just these images. There wasn't really like a narrative. It was just like this thing that would happen, and that was it. But that, and the clown one was like this dream that I had of my like 3-year-old teacher. That really stuck because it was terrifying. Like clowns are terrifying, and it's kind of cliche, and I was really scared about using the clown. Still am kind of, but it's not. I don't know how that plays out, but I sort of got better, and I started to try and lucid dream, and then I decided I kind of wasn't as interested in that because I don't know. I didn't want to control it. But I did write it down pretty diligently for a while and stuff. I go kind of in and out. Yeah.
my favorite piece was the Astrology Orchestra, specifically
Oh,
because
cool.
I read tarot, and I've been reading that for 10 years, and one of the things that was told, that my grandmother told me when she taught me was that the cards will speak to you. I never understood that until like I started reading for a while. And it's just like the connections that you make, and it's for me, it's more about like you were talking about, and also in brainwaves, those connections that are made and things that don't make sense, but your train of thought makes sense to you. Have you explored other mysticisms and the science behind other mysticisms?
A little bit. I mean, when I went to India, I was really fascinated with Hindu culture, and I do transcendental meditation. And I am interested in the occult a little bit. I have a friend who's really into it. But, but with the Astrology Orchestra, I mean, one of the things I was really interested in was this, like, kind of time as a kind of calibration system and stuff. And so, but I'm interested in all these different kinds of, like, headspaces and ways of thinking, belief systems. And so I like trying to sort of traffic through as many systems as I can. And so, and there's certain systems that, for whatever reason, I gravitate to more than others, and I don't know why that is. But yeah, I am interested for sure. Yeah.
When you're thinking up these pieces in your head, do you see the finished product and work towards it, or do you start with something really basic and let it kind of create itself organically?
Usually it's the latter. I mean, every once in a while I kind of have an idea that might be sort of fully formed. Like weirdly, this piece, I sort of knew what I wanted to some degree, and I had to make the interface piece to get there. And so, I mean, I didn't really know what was going to happen because, I mean, making the interface piece was a lot of work just to get to this one piece. And so, but that's kind of the way that I work. Usually it's sort of like, because it's sort of system-based, there's something that's sort of dictating it to some degree, like the system of the body, or like a thought pattern or something like that. But then and that's what kind of keeps me going, is the fact that it's open-ended, that I don't know the answer. Otherwise I think it would be really boring, like, I don't know. So, yeah.
With the piece where you were having people put information in, was the reason that you couldn't, or you didn't feel like you could bring it to another location as easily because you like to have new information from the previous location included when it goes to the next area, or is it entirely new information each time?
No, that's a really good question. It was in LA first, and then it went to Philadelphia. And one of the things that I really like about that piece is that each place has to respond to the existing information, and that sort of shapes. So in Philly, I noticed there was some information that seemed to react to things that were missing in the sort of associative chain, so there was sort of like these, so they would inform each other in different ways. And then Claremont was really weird. I think it was just like sort of a thing where students had a weird, like, sort of reaction to interaction. And sometimes that's, sometimes people don't like to interact. Like sometimes people like to experience something as a visual thing. And so I don't tell you, it was just something that sort of happened that way. And so it's a difficult piece because it's always being shown in progress. Like, I don't ever feel like it's finished, and I don't always the way it looks aesthetically, like it always feels incomplete to me, which feels kind of like a no-no. And so it's a little, that's one of the reasons why it's kind of hard for it to move. And it has to have a space where people can sort of interact with it. So schools are a really great place because it's sort of a public place that's very communal, and there's so that's a good environment. But yeah, it's weird.
You were saying that the process is organic and that it often, sorry, that the process was organic and they often feel that it's incomplete. So how do you know or feel that it's ready to actually display and put in front of people?
Well, that was the FYI is the only piece that I really feel like is sort of incomplete. And so it's just when and this will be the last question I answer. I'm getting a signal. But I think like I think it has to do with the sort of exhausting the information that I have, and with that piece in particular, like just sort of exhausting it, and then I feel like there's, well, it's ready to this